Hello, could you just introduce yourself, please?
Yes, hello. I'm Nick Grayson from Birmingham City Council, and I'm their Climate Change and Sustainability Manager.
You explained in terms of understanding climate change impacts, Birmingham is the most mapped city in the world. Could you explain a little more?
Yeah, it might come as a surprise to people, and other cities have been in touch because they're very interested in the work we're doing. What was buried within the sort of Stern review that came out in 2006 that sort of shocked the world into waking up to the impacts of climate change, what people saw were the headlines of how much it was going to cost and how much it was going to cost to get out of the conundrum or the problem we've got of 1% of GDP. But what was in there was that there was some really good advice and guidance about what places, locations should do for themselves to understand their local impacts. So how can you convert a global issue into something that's very tangible? So in Birmingham we grabbed that and we got some research funding together with the university and decided to build our own climate impact model. So there was there is a very successful climate division there, and in fact one of the members of the IPCC is based at the University of Birmingham. So we've got a very good sort of academic grounding there. What we needed was to understand not only the issues in relation to the city, but who would it affect, how would it affect, and how closely could you predict those changes. So one of the most significant things that happens in cities all over the world is when you get extended heat wave periods is you get what's called an urban heat island. So you get excessive nighttime temperatures because the built form acts like a radiator. It absorbs that daytime heat and keeps pumping it out. So you get nighttime temperatures in excess of 20 degrees for continuous periods of time, and in fact it can build and become a very serious problem to people with health vulnerabilities, so the very young, the very old. And what you can track is that there are very often hospital admissions spikes that coincide with those heat waves, and worse still, if they're prolonged, you get excessive deaths. So it's a major concern, and it's become one of the indicators that all public health organisations across the UK have to chase out and try and understand. So we work with them as well as the university, mapping the heat island across the city. What we overlaid that on top of were environmental, economic and social data sets that we had for the city, creating new GIS layers so that you could actually show at a neighbourhood scale who's affected and why and when. And then when you start applying all the future scenarios, the colour map changes. It starts to get more intense. And when you sit that alongside the public health data sets you've got, you realise that you're in trouble because there's communities that are very vulnerable here. So we did that, but as part of those sort of other sets of data, if you like, we looked at things like flood risk, air quality, all these other things, because there's compound effects. So things, it's not just heat, it's actually have all these sort of compound effects, all of which have a potential detrimental effect on people. And there's something you can do about it. You can change your built form, you can introduce greenery, water in whatever way you can, green roofs, trees, green roots, to help sort of dilute that impact. And so the model that we built in the end had the potential to add and subtract some of these elements so that you could actually do a current scenario and a future scenario and then an intervention and what that would have in terms of an impact. So that was successful. What that's led on to is that the university have then gained further research grants to be able to put out 231 automated temperature sensors across the city on a grid, virtually a kilometre square because the city is 267 kilometre squares, And we've also got weather stations, automated weather stations. Amazing. You can get them just as a block like this big, and they do everything that the old-fashioned weather stations used to do, but they're automated, they're Wi-Fi, and, you know, fantastic. We've got those in locations around the city linked to schools and linked to energy substations, because one of the most vulnerable things in heat waves are energy substations, so the big six energy companies are very concerned about that. So the location of those has been chosen, and we're then using those readings to backcast into the model to verify that the model is correct. And so we've got a further PhD that's retesting that model and making sure it's robust, and we're filtering into that this whole thing of wind direction, urban forestry, trees, and our key partner in that is Public Health England, so we're looking at these overlaps with health stats and ambulance service and ambulance service provision, so that the whole thing comes a bit more sort of joined up.
You spoke about the natural city, capital city model. What is that?
Okay, well, this whole 3-day extravaganza is really focusing on, do we have some solutions around sustainable development? And it's a big global concern at the moment. One of the fundamental sort of gaps in our knowledge very often is the impact development has on the natural environment at a local scale and also at a global scale. Are we actually building those calculations into our decision making and our outcome values as to whether or not that development is profitable? Because if it's profitable at the future's expense, is it actually profitable? So one of those strands is this whole thing of natural capital. And so we've mapped the city from an ecosystem services point of view, which is the first UK city to do that, using the same science as the National Ecosystem Assessment. And then we've chosen to use that same application or scientific knowledge on a site scale, so that you look at a potential development site and question, what's the carrying capacity of that site? How is any proposed development going to impact on the natural environment, and what the natural environment gives us for free in terms of ecosystem services? So clean water, clean air, a healthy environment, etc. How can we extract the understanding of those impacts for a site and then build it into our decision making, so that when we design that future development, we can test as various scenarios and options how dependent it is on the natural environment, what the net outcome is. And our overall tool aims that you have a net positive effect, so that the development has a net positive effect, not only at the point of sale or the point of transfer, but actually over an extended time frame, so that we want something that starts to address those longer term questions. So essentially that's what it is. It's an Excel-based decision-making tool. We've worked it up with industrial partners and environmental economists, and we're field testing it right now, both in the city and out of the city on various sites, to make sure that it's robust. And we'd like to take it further with future funding, but it seems as if it's hit the right mark. Lots of people have seen it as being a positive contribution, and in fact DEFRA, who were the funding agency behind it, are going to publish it as part of their National Ecosystem Assessment follow-on project as an example of best practices, how ecosystems can be implemented rather than just talked about.
You explained that there was a link between natural infrastructure and health. Are there any outstanding examples in Birmingham?
Okay, well again, I suppose I've touched on that with that climate change issue. There's a huge relationship between people's response to living in cities and their exposure to a natural environment. All sorts of studies have been done around the world. One of the most groundbreaking ones from a medical point of view is done by Manoli and partners, and what they've published is that actually the root cause of the 5 non-communicable diseases, which is what's going to finish most of us off, cancer, cardiovascular, pulmonary disease, etc., that we're all too familiar with, and is the global concern for Ban Ki-moon and the United Nations, the actual medical cause of that is stress. Now, as a medical shift in understanding, that is having global implications, because suddenly you're not treating stress as an outcome, you're actually treating it as a cause of those concerns. And they've tracked how it changes the metabolism within the body and how the body then malfunctions in order to create those 5 outcomes. So there's a real need to re-understand cities from a human well-being point of view. And exposure to and connection with the natural world is one of the things we're hardwired to do. We've been looking and speaking and walking and talking like this for 100,000 years, so our genetics are programmed to survive in the natural environment. We've only lived in cities for a couple of 100 years. Our genetics are not well suited to dealing with computers, infrastructure, railways, goodness knows what else, and city living. And so we need to understand how you can integrate that well-being as an outcome for cities as part of your sort of spatial planning and development agenda. And so, for example, if you just look at land in the city from different perspectives, one of those perspectives could be seeing it as productive land. So there's an opportunity for people to actually grow their own food. Now, that isn't going to feed a city, but what it is going to do is going to bring about a huge amount of well-being for those people taking part, changing people's behaviours and perspectives, and opening the door to potentially a much healthier lifestyle. And one of the critical ideas where we're trying to bring all these factors together, which we're wanting to trial in a location in Birmingham, is what I've deemed a natural health improvement zone. So you get these areas in the city that we've mapped in terms of poor environments, poor local economy, poor social status, poor health, poor air quality, all these different factors. And they're very often deprived communities in terms of environment as well. Into those, if you introduce greenery, potential walking routes, cycling routes, routes to school, and then monitor the health benefits that people have from taking on board those behavioural changes, you've got a potential where you can set up, using smart cards and monitoring, an exchange between the clinical commissioning groups who are dealing with all those outcomes of stress. And actually, if you can save on their budgets by changing people's lifestyles, there's the potential of a payment back as a saving from the health budgets to maintain those routes. And then you monitor those routes epidemiologically through the constituent citizens group, from an air quality point of view, and from a climate impact point of view over a generation, so that you actually make an evidence base as to why this works. So we're just identified our first zone, and we're wanting to implement it within the city in the next 12 months or so.
Do the communities have any say?
Absolutely. I think this is one of the, it's a big issue in terms of cities, and cities, in my talk I talked about the fact that cities see themselves as sort of part of global networks these days, and very much like to benchmark themselves against other global partners. And it's very easy within those types of scenarios for everything to be top down. It's a huge mistake, because what's critical very often is people's local knowledge is actually infinitely better than any data set you might have, and that was shown out only in the latest round of flooding that we had across the country, where the local people would have been able to predict most of those in terms of what they could observe on the ground. But we've got a process or a way of working where we're trying to bring all these stakeholders together. So business, academics, people from different stakeholder groups and the community looking at and trying to solve these problems, so that you get both sides of the coin. And also it's a way of testing your policy ideas or whatever on communities before actually going ahead and implementing them. And we're surrounded by top-down policies that were implemented in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s or whatever all over the country, all of which are now having to be revisited and re-engineered or socially re-engineered or reinvested in because they've basically failed. And I think there's this global urgency in terms of the impact cities are having in terms of climate change, natural resource consumption and all these other things. There's an urgency that we need to do things. We need to do things differently, and we desperately need to learn some of those lessons from the past. And we just physically haven't got the time and we haven't got the money to carry on making those mistakes. What we have now is a fantastic knowledge base and the ability through ICT and everything else to access that. So really there aren't excuses anymore as to why cities should make massive mistakes. They should get it right, and they should get it right first time, and it should engage and work with the communities. And this whole thing of political governance and goodness knows what else, people have felt very detached from decision making, and so the turnout rate for elections and goodness knows what else is terrible. That's got to be changed. That whole sort of democratic platform needs to be raised, and getting people engaged in their local areas on these sorts of agendas, which they're keen and passionate about, is something that can really help drive that change, and also give the potential for third sector, voluntary sector solutions which can't be delivered by a corporation or a private sector or whatever else. So it has to be a mutual approach. It can't just be a top-down.
Thank you very much.
Okay.